Welcome back, my friend, to another quiet journey into a past that doesn't ask anything of you except to listen and drift. And maybe, if you feel like it, to press the like button, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments where in the world are you watching from tonight? What corner of the map are you falling asleep in as we slip beneath the surface of another strange and forgotten piece of history? Because tonight, we're not climbing castle stairs, or walking through plague-stricken streets, or kneeling before gilded altars. No. Tonight, we step onto weathered wooden planks, sails creaking above us, salt in our mouths, the wind full of mystery and movement. Tonight, you're with pirates. But not the pirates of movies or video games. Not the charming rogues or the swashbuckling legends. These are the pirates of actual history, tough, unwashed, often desperate men who lived by superstition, storms, and strength, and who would likely make you wish you'd never set foot near their ship. Because the truth is, you probably wouldn't last a day with them. You'd want to go home before the sun even set, and here's why. It starts, perhaps surprisingly, with the smell. A pirate ship wasn't just a vessel of plunder. It was a floating trap, humid and tight, filled with the sweat of 24 men who hadn't bathed in weeks, the odor of spoiled rations, of stagnant water below the boards, of animals hiding in the grain stores, of oil, smoke, and the kind of waste you hope never to smell. The sea breeze helped a little, but not enough. Most of the time, it just moved the odor from one place to another. And you, used to soap and showers and personal space, would feel sick by noon, maybe earlier. There were no clean clothes, no toothbrushes, no fresh water for washing, only the occasional storm to rinse the skin. And even that came cold and rough, with sails snapping wildly and ropes that burned your palms if you dared to help. And the food, if you could call it, that was worse. Salted meat crawling with pests, hard biscuits that needed soaking just to chew, and even then, they could hurt your jaw. Water green with age. No fruits, no greens. A slow illness creeping through your gums, making your body ache. And still, you'd have to eat, because hunger was constant. There were no set meals, just whatever was left, whenever it was given, if the quartermaster thought it was your turn. But let's say you get past the food and the grime. Let's say your body adjusts. You still wouldn't last. Not because of the work, though it was exhausting, but because of the company. Pirates weren't gentle, not with each other, and definitely not with newcomers. If you were lucky, they'd ignore you. If not, they'd test you, mock you, assign you the worst tasks, scrubbing the ship's hull, hauling waste buckets, cleaning up after a storm or worse. And you'd do it, because the other option was being left behind with no hope of return. And then there were the sea attacks. You might think the danger came from battle, but it was more than that. It was how sudden it was, chaotic, unpredictable. Smoke filled the air. Shots rang out but rarely landed. Most of the time, it came down to close contact. Blades, tools, shouting. The deck became slippery, and you didn't always know whose side someone was on. And then, if you won, came the rewards. The captured goods. The decisions. Compassion was rare, because you couldn't risk keeping someone who might lead others to your hideout. So even if you weren't the one making the choice, you were still there, holding a light, watching, sometimes doing more. And after all that, the prizes weren't always shiny. Often they were crates of dry leaves, sacks of grain, jars of spice, trade goods, things you could sell at the next port if it didn't turn on you first. And even there, danger waited, because pirates had no safe place, no real protection, no symbol that made you untouchable. The stories weren't always true, but punishment still was. So why live like that? Why stay? The answer is both sad and simple. Freedom. Not the kind we imagine today, but the kind that came from having nowhere else to go. People running from chains, from poverty, from being drafted, from being forgotten. On a pirate ship, no one cared who you had been, only what you could do now, whether you followed the rules, whether you shared what was taken. And their rules, strange as it sounds, were sometimes more balanced than those on land. Leaders were voted in, Rewards were shared by role, not by birth. Everyone had a say in where the ship turned next. The discipline was strict, but it was consistent, predictable, and for some, that was worth the discomfort, the hunger, the danger. But you, with your clean fingers and quiet nights and sense of fairness, well, it would last a few hours, maybe less. The first storm would leave you vomiting. The first fight would leave you shaking. The first night watch, alone with creaking wood and endless dark, would leave you wondering why you ever came. And when the captain barked your name and threw you a mop or a musket, you'd know. This wasn't an adventure, it was survival, and you weren't built for it. But they were, somehow. These broken men, these sea wolves and wanderers, lived and died by wind and blade. And in their own way, they found something close to freedom brief, dirty, dangerous, and unforgettable. And now, as you lie there in your warm bed, eyes heavy, heartbeat calm, remember this. You are not on a ship. You are not under pirate law. The sea is not beneath you. Only the soft pull of sleep. So close your eyes. Let the sails billow. Let the stories drift like fog across your thoughts. And rest. You've made it through your first day. Welcome to the crew. You might think that by sunrise you'd have found your sea legs, that the rocking of the waves would start to feel less like punishment and more like rhythm, like the heartbeat of something ancient and vast beneath your feet. But the truth is, the sea does not care if you are ready, and neither do pirates, because by the second day, the ship is already pulling away from land, the shore a fading memory, and every breath you take tastes like salt and tar and fear, and you begin to realize that nothing on this vessel is familiar, not the language, not the faces, not even the time, because pirates don't live by clocks. They live by tides and shadows and orders barked without warning. And if you hesitate, even for a second, someone else grabs your task. Or worse, someone grabs you and shoves you toward the mast, or the hold, or the galley where the cook, half-blind, toothless, possibly mad, is boiling something in a blackened pot and humming a tune that has no words. And the floor beneath you creaks with every step like a groaning ghost, and your muscles ache in ways you've never known. Not from effort, but from tension, from never quite relaxing, from always watching, always waiting. And even when the wind calms and the sea flattens and the sails hang heavy with stillness, you find no peace. Because now the sun beats down without mercy, turning the deck into a griddle, your skin into parchment, and the men, shirtless, scarred, sunburned, lie about like dogs in the heat, chewing on strips of dried meat or gambling with dice carved from bone. And their voices rise and fall in strange rhythms, full of slang and curses and laughter that makes your spine tighten, because it's not friendly. Not really. It's sharp and dangerous, and you feel, again, like prey. And the worst part is, they know it. They can smell your discomfort like blood in the water, and they test you in small ways at first, asking for your share of water, tossing you rope without warning, nudging your foot with theirs when you sit too long, and if you flinch or hesitate, it grows, it builds. Not into violence necessarily, but into exclusion, which is worse in some ways. Because out here, alone is dangerous. And so you learn to nod when they laugh, to curse when they curse, to look busy when you're not. And that's when you start to understand that piracy isn't just about treasure or fighting, it's about being part of something, no matter how ugly or twisted, because the world left these men behind long before they took to the sea. And now they've made their own world, one where the rules are brutal but clear, where loyalty is currency and cowardice is death. And if you want to survive, you adapt. And adaptation comes quickly on the sea, or not at all. So you find yourself waking before dawn, tying knots with blistered fingers, swabbing the deck in silence, memorizing names and signals and curses. And when a gull lands on the railing, you look at it differently, not as a symbol of land or freedom, but as food, because out here, hunger makes you see everything new, and you start to notice the layers of life aboard the ship, the hierarchy not of title, but of power, who sleeps where, who eats first, who gets the best weapons when a fight looms, and you see how even the captain, feared and obeyed, walks with one eye behind him, because mutiny is never far, and authority on a pirate ship is only as strong as your last victory. And so every man walks a line between respect and rebellion, and you, at the bottom, walk the narrowest line of all, because one mistake, one sign of weakness, and you might be offered as punishment, as example, or just as amusement. And still, you carry on, because something strange begins to happen. Your hands toughen, your eyes adjust to the dark, your ears learn to pick up meaning in the wind, and for the first time, you sense the rhythm, the flow of ship life. And in that flow, in the unity of movement and purpose and survival, there is a kind of peace, not gentle or safe, but real. And in a life where nothing is guaranteed, that reality is its own kind of comfort, and so you begin to move with them, not behind or ahead, but among. And though no one says it, you feel a shift, subtle but unmistakable, and when the lookout cries "sail ho" and all hands rush to arms, you move too, not with fear, but with the dull focus of duty. And the gun is heavy in your hand, and the knife at your belt seems less foreign. And when the ship turns and the chase begins, you find yourself grinning, just a little, because in this moment, you are not who you were. And whether that's good or bad, you can't quite say, but you know this: you have lasted longer than you thought, and the sea, for now, has not swallowed you. Under the heavy stillness of early morning, the ship does not greet the sun with song or cheer, but with the slow groaning of wood and the cough of tired men rising from their damp hammocks, their bodies already stiff from sleep, stolen in brief, broken intervals, their breath misting in the chill that clings to the planks like sweat that has nowhere else to go. And you would stir too, if you'd made it through the night, rubbing your eyes raw, uncertain whether it was the rocking that finally put you to sleep or the sheer weight of exhaustion pulling you down like the sea itself. And there would be no breakfast waiting, no fire crackling in a hearth, just more of that same salt meat, hard biscuit, and maybe a few sips of stale ale if the barrel hadn't turned. And the others wouldn't speak to you kindly. They'd grunt or nudge or ignore you altogether, each man focused on his own business, coiling rope, checking rigging, scraping rust from cannon mounts. And as you stand there trying to make sense of it all, your legs unsure on the moving deck, your stomach turning from the scent of tar and sweat, you realize there is no time to adjust, no moment of grace, because life here begins in the middle, and you are expected to keep up or be left behind. And left behind could mean anything: mockery, punishment, or simply being forgotten in a world that has no patience for softness. And by the time the sun is halfway up the sky, your hands will be raw from pulling lines, your skin red with salt and sun, and the hunger you feel will not just be for food, but for rest, for safety, for stillness, and none of those things will come, not today, not ever, not fully, because this is a life of motion and menace, of scanning the horizon not for beauty, but for sails, because any ship on the edge of sight might bring death or gold or both, and so the eyes of pirates are trained not on the stars, but on the shimmer of distant danger. And that's what you'd have to learn if you wanted to last. How to see the signs in the wind, the slight shift in clouds that meant a squall, the ripple on the water that suggested a reef, the gulls turning inland that warned of a coming storm. And maybe, just maybe, after weeks of this, you'd start to feel it, not understanding, but surrender, a kind of numb rhythm to the days, where your body knew what to do, even if your mind still longed for a bed and a book and a window that didn't swing with every wave. But even then, the tests wouldn't stop, because life at sea was always a gamble, and luck was as much a currency as gold. And if yours ran out if you slipped while climbing the rigging, if a rope snapped, If you failed to spot the reef in time, there was no apology, no comfort, only the cold water and the quick forgetting. And the ship would sail on, lighter by one soul, and the men would drink to your memory or not at all, because memory was a burden here, and survival required lightness, detachment, a kind of practiced cruelty that let you laugh through rot and sing through blood. And if you couldn't find that hardness in yourself, the crew would know, and they would push you harder, test you further, until you broke or adapted or vanished altogether. And even if you endured, even if you became one of them in sweat and scars, you'd never quite belong. Because to truly belong, you had to have been broken before the ship ever found you. You had to come to it already hollowed out, already burnt at the edges, and most likely you didn't. And that's why you wouldn't last, because you came seeking a story, an escape, a thrill, and this is not a story. It's a sentence, not a thrill, but a trade. Freedom for danger, equality for brutality, democracy for death. And still, men chose it again and again, not for glory, but because it was the only place they could be fully themselves, ugly, wild, and free. And maybe that's the cruelest part of all. The knowledge that for many, this floating hell was still better than the land they left behind. And so, as the days blur into each other and the horizon remains an endless ribbon of sky and sea, you begin to feel the stretch of time not in hours or dates, but in wounds that scab and reopen, in the weight of sweat-soaked clothes that never quite dry, in the rough growth of a beard you can't shave, and the rattle in your chest that won't leave. And even the voices around you start to shift, growing coarser, shorter, less like conversation, and more like code grunts, nods, quick glances that say more than words ever could. And the language of pirates, you realize, is not learned but absorbed, like the reek of the ship itself, creeping into your hair and skin and soul, and soon enough, you forget what you smelled like before, or how silence sounded on land, or what it meant to rest without rocking. And maybe, in your darker moments, you start to envy the rats that scurry along the beams above your hammock, because at least they can leave if they want, swimming to shore if one appears, whereas you are bound by duty, by fear, by the quiet understanding that to return to who you were before this would feel like drowning in fresh water. And when land does finally appear on the horizon, you do not cheer like you once thought you would, because land means decisions, means ports where bounty posters hang and knives flash faster than greetings, where women smile with their mouths and curse with their eyes, where every coin you spend might be your last if you forget to tip the wrong man or speak too loudly in the wrong tavern. And so shore leave becomes a performance, a dance with death in the costume of drunken freedom. And when you stumble back aboard, lighter in pocket but heavier in heart, the sea welcomes you not with forgiveness, but with indifference. Waves slapping the hull like laughter at your foolishness, and still you hoist the sail, still you scrub the deck, still you follow the captain's orders with a nod that no longer feels false, because now you are part of the ship, and whether you meant to or not, whether you hate it or not, the sea has carved its initials into your bones, and every creak of the mast feels like a thought you might have had once, and every gull's cry sounds like a name you forgot long ago. And that's when you understand that the true cruelty of pirate life isn't the violence or the hunger or the fear, but the way it changes you so deeply that even if you did survive, even if you returned to land and washed off the grime and found clean clothes and soft bread and a warm bed, none of it would feel real anymore. None of it would fit, and you would lie awake in that soft bed, dreaming of ropes and rigging and rough laughter and black water, and you would miss it, against all reason, against all sense, and that is why you wouldn't last, not because you are weak, but because you are still whole, still soft, still hoping for a world that rewards kindness and decency and comfort, and the pirate world has no space for those things, only for scars and shadows and salt. And now that you know this, as your breath slows and your thoughts begin to drift like sea foam on the tide, you can let go of the ship, let go of the noise and the pain and the press of too many bodies in too little space, and sink gently into sleep, where the sea is calm and the sails are full, and no one is shouting your name. You wouldn't last, because pirates didn't live by the rules of nations, of churches, of kings. They lived by codes written in blood and rum, passed from mouth to mouth in dark corners of ships and smoky taverns where truth had sharp edges and loyalty was the only true currency. And if you think you could have reasoned with them, argued, pleaded, or bargained, you'd quickly learn that your words hold no weight here, not without scars to back them or silence to sharpen them. Because in this world, the loudest man dies first, and the quietest man listens long enough to win, and every crew had its balanced brawlers and thinkers, killers and charmers, men who knew how to gut a fish and men who knew how to gut a man, and all of them were needed in their own cruel ways, because piracy was not chaos. It was a brutal, fragile order maintained by shared desperation and the constant presence of death. And you, with your soft hands and your clean conscience, would break that balance, would draw eyes and questions and whispers, and soon you'd find yourself outside the circle, not punished, not beaten, not even named, just ignored, invisible, until you began to doubt your own place, your own worth. And in that doubt, the sea would find you, because it always does, slipping into the cracks of your mind like cold water, reminding you that out here, identity is earned, not given, and survival is a performance without end. And there are no rehearsals, only scenes played out with knives and fire and the howling wind. And when you faltered, when your knees gave out or your voice cracked or your gaze dropped, that would be the moment they judged you not with malice, but with the same instinct they used to judge a sail or a storm. And if you were found wanting, they wouldn't kill you, not always, but they'd stop carrying you, stop saving you, stop caring whether you ate or slept or lived. And that kind of death is slower, quieter, and it seeps into your bones like rot, and still, you'd stay. Because the idea of leaving feels worse. Because once you've seen the sea from a pirate's deck, felt the wind like a blade against your face, heard the scream of cannon fire split the sky, and watched a ship break in half like dry bread, land feels fake, too still, too soft, too far removed from the rawness you've come to understand as real life. And this is the cruelest trick of piracy, that it breaks you and rebuilds you into something that cannot belong anywhere else. A creature of salt and smoke and silence, and by the time you realize that, it's too late to go back, too late to unlearn the rhythm of waves or the language of danger. And so you remain, not because you love it, but because it is the only place that matches the shape of your broken edges. And when the storm comes, and it always comes, you won't pray like you once did. You won't curse the heavens or plead for mercy. You'll just move. With the crew, with the wind, with the ship that is more home to you now than your own name. And in that movement, in that surrender, you'll find something like peace, not the soft peace of safety, but the hard peace of acceptance, of knowing your place in the world and no longer fighting it. And that, more than anything, is why you wouldn't last, not because the pirates are cruel or the sea is merciless, but because you still believe in escape, in rescue, in the return to something better. And out here, those beliefs will only weigh you down, like gold in a sinking chest, pulling you under, until you are nothing but bubbles and silence and the soft memory of someone who once thought they could survive a world built on ruin. You wouldn't last a day with pirates, because by the third sunrise, your body would already be rebelling, your shoulders aching from hauling rope you barely understand, your palms blistered and raw, your thighs bruised from the swaying of the ship that never, ever stops moving, even when it seems still, even when the sails hang limp and the water mirrors the sky. And you'd realize that sleep is no longer a destination but a gamble, stolen in the hours between watches, in hammocks that swing like cradles for the damned, surrounded by men whose snores sound like growls and whose dreams, if they dream at all, are not of home or peace, but of fire and salt and blood. And you would try, perhaps, to stay clean, to keep your hands washed and your clothes dry, But quickly you'd understand that the sea doesn't allow for such luxuries, that every surface is slick with moisture, every garment stinks of mildew, and your own skin begins to feel foreign, like a coat you cannot remove. And your voice, when you speak, is either ignored or mocked, unless you shout, and even then, someone might laugh, not because you're funny, but because you're trying too hard. And on the third day, you'd be tested again, not by the crew, but by the sea itself, with a sudden squall that darkens the sky and lifts the waves into mountains. And you'd find yourself scrambling across the deck, soaked to the bone, trying to tie knots with trembling fingers, while thunder cracks above you like cannon fire, and men scream orders that sound more like curses, and somehow, through luck or sheer will, you'd survive it, only to collapse afterward, shaking, your heart racing. And when you look around for sympathy, you'd find none. Only shrugs and smirks and the low sound of a fiddle from below decks, playing a tune so haunting it makes your teeth ache. And that night, as you lie awake in the dark, listening to the groan of the timbers and the rats scuttling just inches from your head, you'd realize that the ship is alive, not in a romantic way, but in the way of things that endure, that evolve, that consume. And it is consuming you, bit by bit, replacing your softness with callous, your caution with calculation, and your hope with something colder, harder, something that does not break but bends, and the bending hurts. Not just in your body, but in your soul, because you start to forget things. The names of streets you once walked, the taste of fruit, the feel of grass underfoot, and you begin to remember only the sea, the salt, the endless motion, and the faces around you, scarred and hollow-eyed, begin to seem familiar, even comforting, because at least they understand. At least they don't ask for anything more than what you can give. And that's when you truly begin to change, not all at once, but gradually, like wood warping in heat, until one morning you wake and realize you haven't thought of home in days, and you're not sure if you miss it or if it ever truly existed. And when you see your reflection in a bucket of rainwater, you barely recognize yourself, not just the beard or the grime, but the eyes, the way they scan the horizon not for land, but for sails, for danger, for opportunity. And when the order comes to board another vessel, to swing across the gap with blade in hand, your fear is still there, but it is quieter now, like an old friend who watches but does not speak. And you move, because movement is the only thing that makes sense. And when the chaos begins, screams, gunfire, the clash of steel, you do not run, because there is nowhere to run, only forward, into the madness. And after it's over, after the smoke clears and the bodies are counted, you do not weep, you do not tremble, you simply breathe. And that breath feels more honest than any you took on land, because it is earned, paid for in sweat and blood. And though you still sleep with one eye open and a hand near your blade, there is a rhythm to it now, a familiarity that feels almost sacred. And in the quiet hours, when the crew sings low songs in languages you don't know, when the stars wheel overhead and the sea murmurs like a mother, you begin to wonder if perhaps this is who you were always meant to be. Not a farmer, not a clerk, not a husband, but a shadow among shadows. A voice in the storm, a man who belongs nowhere but here, on this ever-moving world of wood and wind and war. And that thought both terrifies and comforts you, because now you understand that the sea does not give, it only takes, and what it leaves behind is not the same as what was taken. It is something else, something sharper, something colder. And though you still dream, those dreams are no longer of home, but of sails unfurling against a dawn sky, of gold glinting beneath blood, of laughter that masks sorrow, and silence that hides guilt. And in those dreams, you are not lost, you are not afraid, you are only moving forward, forever forward. And if that is not freedom, then nothing is. And yet, you know that most who try to live this life fail, not because they are weak, but because they do not bend, because they do not listen, because they do not understand that to survive among pirates is to become less of what you were and more of what you need to be. And that is why you wouldn't last, not even a day. Because to last is not to endure pain or hunger or fear. It is to welcome them, to wear them like a second skin, to let them hollow you out until all that remains is instinct and resolve and a fierce, burning will to keep going, no matter what. And that, more than any blade or pistol or bottle of rum, is what makes a pirate. And unless you are ready to give up everything, your name, your past, your very sense of self, you will not survive. You will sink quietly, unnoticed, like so many before you, swallowed by a sea that forgets just as quickly as it devours. You wouldn't last a day with pirates, because the moment the ship raised anchor and pulled away from the shore, the world you knew would vanish behind you like mist burned off by the rising sun, and in its place would come a brutal simplicity that demanded everything and offered nothing in return except survival. And even that, only if you earned it every waking moment, for life aboard a pirate vessel was not the romantic blur of adventure and treasure maps your stories might suggest. It was hard wood beneath thin boots, cold salt in every cut, eyes that watched you not with friendship but calculation, and as the days stretched on, indistinguishable from each other in their heat, labor, and hunger, you would begin to feel yourself fray, not just at the edges, but deep within, where your beliefs used to live, because out here, belief was a liability, hope a weakness, and faith something to laugh at over mugs of watered ale. And your first true lesson would come not from the captain's orders or the quartermaster's glares, but from the silence, the long, thick quiet between commands, when men moved without speaking, when the wind died and the sea turned glassy and the air felt too still, as if the world were holding its breath. And in that stillness, you would feel a weight settle in your chest, the realization that calm at sea wasn't peacefulness, but a kind of tension disguised as quiet, a pause that whispered of what was coming next. And when the storm finally arrived, as it always did, it wouldn't ask permission. It would descend suddenly, without warning. The sky would darken, clouds churning on the horizon like smoke rising from some distant blaze, and flashes of lightning would flicker like quick glances of something sharp just beyond the edge of sight. The crew wouldn't panic. They wouldn't shout. They would move quick, steady, focused while you staggered in the downpour, rain stinging your face, hands slipping on wet ropes, vision blurred. And when the mast groaned like something ancient under pressure, you would feel your pulse rise, not from panic, but from something deeper, the sense that time itself had changed. And even if you made it through, if the ship held, the sails held, no one was lost. You would find no relief. No one would say, "Good job." They would simply continue to the next task, the next hour, the next unknown. You would begin to understand that out here, staying alive wasn't a success. It was simply expected. And everyone around you, exhausted, worn, silent, had accepted that long ago. Your struggles wouldn't be special. They'd be part of the rhythm. And when tension finally boiled over, not in blades, but in clenched fists, harsh words, hands shoved, and faces struck, you might hesitate, expecting someone to stop it. But no one would. Because here, conflict was part of how things worked. And afterward, those same men might laugh, pass a shared cup, trade a crust of bread. Because here, hardship was the language. And those who bore it without complaint earned a kind of respect. And you, still stunned by what you saw, still clutching your side or nursing a bruise, would begin to see how far you had to go. And go you would further than you thought possible, until the moments that once shocked you now barely stirred you. Until you found yourself unaffected by things that once would have haunted you. Until you, too, smirked when another was pushed down or shoved aside, not out of cruelty, but because that's how things were. And that smirk, it would stay with you, because it meant something inside had shifted, something once precious. And by the time the crew reached land again, some quiet island where trees swayed and waves sparkled, you wouldn't feel like a traveler. You'd feel like part of something else, something uninvited, and that might not bother you anymore. And when treasure changed hands, or deals were made, or power was quietly asserted, you wouldn't ask whether it felt right, because asking meant believing you had a choice. And the sea had taken that already long before it took your rest or your sense of direction. And when the captain gathered everyone and announced a ship 2 days east, heavy with goods, your heart would stir not with fear, but with urgency. Because by then, you'd learn the rhythm, you'd learn the hunger. And even if you told yourself it was just survival, just necessity, you'd know better. Because the sea doesn't lie, it reveals. And what it had revealed in you was something unexpected. Something that belonged. And that's why you wouldn't last a day. Not because you weren't strong or capable or willing, but because when the time came to walk away, you might not. And that moment, the one when you chose salt over soil, storm over peace, that would change you. And no one, not even you, would realize how far you drifted until it was too late. You wouldn't last a day among pirates, because eventually you'd see that nothing aboard the ship was truly yours. Not your time, not your place, not even your name, if they gave you another, and that new name, whatever it was, would follow you. It would be used when you were needed, shouted when things went wrong, whispered when decisions were made. And you'd respond to it not because you liked it, but because saying no became too tiring. And tiredness, real tiredness, was something you'd come to understand deep down, in your hands, in the way your shoulders curled when you tried to rest, always listening for the next order, the next wave, the next shift. Eventually, you'd stop asking why things were done, because asking was risky. It made you noticeable. And people who stood out too much, they often weren't around for long. You'd learn to be quiet, to nod, to act. And even when your mind whispered questions, your body would keep moving. Because keeping pace was easier than falling behind. And falling behind well. Will blend together like waves, indistinguishable in their repetition, until only the occasional port brings any change. And even then, it's not relief but temptation whores with sharp eyes, merchants with sharper tongues, dockside brawls that begin over nothing and end with a body floating face down in the tide. And you'll see things on land that make the ship seem almost holy in comparison. Because at least on the ship, the rules are clear, the expectations brutal but honest. But in port lies where perfume and smiles, and if you fall for them, you'll pay, with coin or with blood or with something you can't name but feel missing afterward. And when the ship leaves again, when the sails rise and the anchor lifts and the land becomes a line on the horizon, you'll feel something strange relief, as if the sea, for all its danger, has become your sanctuary. And that thought will trouble you, because sanctuaries aren't supposed to smell like rot and tar and gunpowder. And yet here you are, breathing deep, feeling more at ease in a place that could kill you in a dozen ways than you ever felt in your old bed. And that comfort will grow, will curl around you like smoke, until you can't tell where your fear ends and your loyalty begins. And when a crewmate dies, because someone always does, you'll help carry the body to the edge, you'll watch it slide into the water, you'll listen to the brief prayer or the crude joke. And you won't cry, not because you don't care, but because crying feels inappropriate, feels wasteful, feels like something you've forgotten how to do, and later, when you scrub the blood from the deck, you won't think of the man's laugh, or his stories, or the way he used to hum to himself at night. You'll think only of how slippery the boards are beneath your feet. And that's how it starts, the hollowing, the slow erosion of sentiment, replaced not with cruelty, but with numbness. And numbness is more dangerous, because it lets you do things you never thought possible, lets you stand still while others suffer, lets you smile at violence, lets you sleep soundly after taking something that wasn't yours. And when the captain calls for votes, for decisions, for hands to be raised and voices to be counted, you'll find your own hand lifting before your mind has caught up, because agreement is safety, and dissent is a noose. And pirates don't need reasons to mistrust. They only need moments, glances, silences, and one mistake can mark you forever. And you've seen what happens to those who are marked, kept at a distance, blamed for misfortune, accused of cowardice or treachery, and eventually, one night, they vanish. And no one speaks of them again, as if their absence is a kindness, a relief, and you'll tell yourself that you're not like them, that you've earned your place, that you belong, but deep down, you'll wonder. And that wondering will keep you awake more than the storms or the rats or the creaking of the hull, because it whispers that no matter how much you change, how much you adapt, you are still an outsider, still a man trying to wear a mask made of scars that aren't yours. And sooner or later, someone will notice, and when they do, when their gaze lingers a second too long, you'll feel the panic rise. Not the loud panic of flight, but the cold panic of being seen, truly seen, and you'll try to bury it, to drink it away, to fight it with laughter and work and sleep, but it will remain, a quiet companion, a reminder that the sea forgives nothing, and forgets no one, and the crew forgets even less, and that is why you wouldn't last not because you lack strength or will, but because the moment you begin to believe you've become one of them, the moment you forget who you were, the sea will remind you, and the reminder will not be kind. You wouldn't last a day with pirates, because the moment the first cannon is fired in anger, your world would collapse into chaos so loud and blinding it would make you question whether your ears had ever known silence at all. And you'd learn that battle at sea is not the cinematic clash of steel and glory the tales pretend it is, but a deafening, disorienting blur of smoke and screams and splinters, where the deck beneath you bucks like a wounded beast, and your hands, slick with sweat and blood, can barely grip the rope or the blade or the pistol that you're not even sure you've loaded correctly, and all the while, the air burns with the tang of salt and powder and something else, something bitter, something metallic that you later realize is fear, not yours alone, but collective, thick enough to taste, and in the storm of violence you won't hear orders, won't see clearly, won't understand what's happening until it's over, and when it is, when the smoke thins and the groans of the wounded rise louder than the shouts of the living, you'll find yourself frozen, not from cowardice, but from a numbness that creeps in like fog, because what you've just witnessed isn't natural, isn't survivable in the way stories make it seem, and yet here you are, standing on red-streaked wood, surrounded by men who have already begun laughing, already begun looting, already moved on, and you'll envy them not for their cruelty, but for their ability to carry on, to compartmentalize, to function in a world that you are only just beginning to understand. And in that understanding comes dread, because if this is the norm, if this is the standard, then who do you have to become to survive it? And as you stare at the face of the first man you've killed, yes, you. Because even if your hand was uncertain, your blade still found flesh, you'll realize that remorse has no place here, that apology is a language no one speaks, and even if you whispered it, even if you meant it, the sea would swallow it before it reached another soul, and over the next few days, as the ship is cleaned and the wounded are buried or patched or forgotten, you'll learn that time on a pirate vessel does not pause for grief. And when new spoils are divided rum, coins, trinkets, even books, whose titles no one can read, you'll be handed your share, and with trembling fingers, you'll take it. Not because you want it, but because refusing would be noticed. And being noticed is dangerous. And later, in the dark, when the songs begin, low and haunted, sung in half-languages you do not understand, you'll feel your eyes sting not with tears, but with fatigue. And you'll realize that you haven't truly slept since before the battle, haven't truly felt safe even in the hammock that sways like a pendulum above the bilge. And in the night, when your eyes finally close, your dreams will not be yours, but borrowed from the dead, fragments of screams and blood and flame, and when you wake, sweating and shivering, you won't speak of it, because no one else does, and soon, you'll begin to forget details, not just of the fight, but of your old life, your old name, the sound of your mother's voice, or the smell of your home, and you'll tell yourself it's because you're focused, because you're adapting, but deep down you'll know it's because forgetting is easier, forgetting hurts less, forgetting lets you function in a place where pain is perpetual and mercy is rare. And as you scrub the deck or climb the rigging or stare out at the endless gray horizon, you'll start to wonder if the man you were is gone, and whether that's a loss or a mercy. And when the next target appears, a fat merchant ship with white sails and a slow turn, you won't hesitate, you won't question, you'll move with the others, shouting and loading and leaping, and when it's over, when the smoke clears and the spoils are tallied, you'll find yourself smiling, not out of joy, but out of relief. Relief that you lived, that you weren't the one thrown overboard or stabbed in the confusion. And that smile will linger longer than it should, and you'll hate it. But you won't stop it, because here, smiling means surviving, and surviving means belonging, and belonging means no one asks what you used to be, only what you can still do, and that is why you wouldn't last. Not because the sea would kill you quickly, but because it would kill you slowly, by degrees, by erosion, by making you someone you never meant to be. And one morning, when you catch your reflection in a cracked mirror or a still bucket, you won't recognize the eyes staring back, not because they're hardened or cruel, but because they no longer look away. You wouldn't last a day with pirates, because even when the seas were calm, when the sails hung lazy in the wind and the sun cast golden streaks across the waves, the true enemy wasn't the ocean or the weather, it was time. Endless and heavy, ticking silently in the minds of men too long confined to wood and rope and sky, and as days without action accumulated like dust in a forgotten room, you would see the ship become something else, something restless and raw, where every glance lingered too long, every word sounded like a threat, and silence itself became oppressive, thick with the weight of things left unsaid, and it would start subtly, with muttering, with staring, with laughter that didn't quite reach the eyes, but then it would grow, like mold, like infection, until tension bled from every creak of the hull and every shadow cast by the rigging, and you'd begin to dread the hours between duties, because that's when the crew had time to remember their grievances, to tally the injustices they felt, real or imagined, and you'd learn that pirate justice is rarely about fairness, and always about dominance. And that dominance is enforced not just through strength, but through spectacle. And one evening, just before dusk, you'd watch as a man was dragged to the mast not for theft or mutiny, but for insolence, for speaking out of turn, for being inconvenient and tied with rope that had seen too many storms, and whipped not with rage but with ritual. And as the skin broke and the blood flew and the men around you roared in cruel approval, you would not cry out, because you would know better, would know that pity is dangerous, that mercy is a weakness only the dead afford. And afterward, when the punished man slumped in the corner barely breathing, you would bring him water when no one was looking, not because you're noble, but because you needed to do something human, anything human, just to remind yourself that you still could. And in that moment, you'd understand the terrible alchemy of pirate life, that cruelty isn't born, it's taught, carved into the soul one lash at a time. And the worst part isn't the pain. It's the normalization of pain, the way it becomes background noise, as ordinary as the call of gulls or the slap of waves against wood. And in the quiet that follows violence, you would feel the ship breathe differently, as if appeased, as if fed, and you'd wonder how much longer until it fed again, and whether you'd be the next offering. And on nights when the moon was bright and the sea glittered like scattered coins, you'd find no romance in the view, only isolation, because even with 20 men aboard, you would feel utterly alone. And worse, you would start to prefer it, because connection was a liability, and caring for someone meant grieving them, and grief was a luxury none of you could afford. And when news came of a nearby frigate, wealthy, soft, ripe, you'd see the ship come alive not with excitement but with hunger, a collective sharpening of the senses, and you would understand that piracy wasn't about gold or fame or rebellion. It was about appetite, about never having enough, And when the battle came and ended and the bodies lay broken and the treasures spilled across the deck like confetti, you would take your share, your bloody, silent share, and you would not protest. Because protest gets you watched, and being watched is the first step toward being punished. And so you'd smile, just enough, just right, and pretend the weight in your gut is hunger and not guilt. And later, when the wind returned and the sails swelled and the stars came out like pinpricks in the canvas of night, you'd lie awake, rocked by a ship that now felt less like a home and more like a predator, always moving, always watching, and you'd realize the truth you've tried not to speak aloud, that this life is not survivable, only postponable, that every day aboard is a gamble against madness, that the sea doesn't break you with storms or shipwrecks, but with routine, with the slow drip of moral erosion, with the unspoken rule that the only thing worse than being afraid is letting anyone see it. And that is why you wouldn't last, not because you couldn't fight or sail or even kill, but because you'd reach a point where you stopped questioning if you still deserved to go back to who you were before. And when that moment comes, you'd realize that surviving doesn't mean winning, it just means forgetting how to leave. You wouldn't last a day with pirates because even if you managed to adjust to the creaking decks, the salt rough air, and the scent of bodies that rarely knew clean water, you would never grow accustomed to the lies because pirate life is built on them, stacked like barrels in the hold, and each one leaks something poisonous into the hearts of the men who carry them, and it begins with small lies. Innocent deceptions about where the ship is bound or how many coins were really taken from the last prize. And you tell yourself that these are necessary, that secrets keep peace, but over time the lies compound until no one really knows what's true anymore, and you would see it in the way men talk, with half smiles and half truths, their eyes flickering to see who listens and who remembers too much. And you'd begin to second-guess every word, every gesture, every friendly pat on the back that lingers too long, and soon your own tongue would falter, hesitant, choosing safety over sincerity. And then you would realize that the silence that hangs heavy at night isn't born from sleep or fatigue, but from fear. Because no one wants to be the one who says the wrong thing and vanishes. And you would understand then that there is no brotherhood, no camaraderie, only a fragile detente upheld by threats and traditions and the shared knowledge that if the crew turns on itself, everyone sinks, and this realization would carve a hollow into you, a quiet space where trust used to live, and that hollowness would ache most when you remembered the world before the sea, the simplicity of honesty, of conversat, ions that weren't loaded, of relationships not measured by usefulness or loyalty under pressure, and you try to fill it with rum or laughter or the rush of boarding another ship, but nothing fits quite right. And each attempt feels like dressing a wound that refuses to heal. And the worst part is that sometimes, in moments of strange peace, you'd feel almost grateful for the lies. Because truth, when it does show itself, is too sharp, too bright. And one evening, when a storm brews and the sky turns the color of old bruises, you'd hear the story of a man who once questioned the captain's decisions, calmly, reasonably, and disappeared the next morning, not punished, not expelled, simply erased, his hammock gone, his name unspoken, and the way the crew avoids mentioning him would chill you more than any punishment could, because silence is scarier than screams, and you would think about that man often, especially when your own questions begin to rise like bubbles in your throat, and you'd learn to swallow them, to press them down, and with each suppression, you'd lose a piece of yourself, not violently, not all at once, but subtly, like sand slipping through your fingers, until you wonder if there's anything left. And still you'd smile. Still you'd laugh when expected. Still you'd raise your tin cup in toasts you no longer believe in, because that is survival. And on this ship, survival is everything. And you would find yourself envying the loudest among the crew, the ones who seem unbothered by the ambiguity, who wear confidence like armor and spit lies like poetry, but deep down, you'd know they're just better actors. that even they feel the weight, that no one escapes it, not even the captain, who stares too long at the horizon some nights and clutches old letters in a hand that has taken lives. And you would begin to see that piracy isn't just a job or a rebellion or a last resort. It's a transformation, a shedding of skin, and each day you remain, another part of your old self slurs away, and one day, you'd hear your own voice tell a lie so smoothly, so convincingly, that it would take you hours to realize it was false. And that moment would terrify you more than any battle or punishment, because it would mean the sea has made you one of its own, not through salt or storms, but through deception, slow and relentless. And you would sit in your hammock that night, rocking with the rhythm of the waves, and try to remember the sound of your own honesty. But it would feel foreign, like a language you once spoke but now only understand in fragments, and you would close your eyes and pretend that this is what you wanted, that this was always the plan. But somewhere in the back of your mind, a voice would whisper that you're adrift, not just on the ocean, but within yourself. And that is why you wouldn't last, not because you couldn't fight or lie or endure, but because eventually you wouldn't remember who you were lying to anymore. And that kind of loss is something even the sea can't bury. You wouldn't last a day with pirates because eventually you'd have to come to terms with what they truly were, men who had severed every tie to the world you came from, men who once had mothers and children and lands to till and songs they loved, but who now moved through life like ghosts that refused to die. And if you thought that piracy was about freedom, you'd find that freedom, in its rawest form, is terrifying, because it means no rules to protect you, no courts to appeal to, no reputations to rely on, only your own fists, your own wits, and your willingness to do whatever it takes to survive. And you'd learn that lesson not during battle, but afterward, when the blood is dry and the wounded cry softly in corners, when spoils are divided not by need or fairness, but by cunning and fear. And you would see the quiet calculus behind every glance: who is useful, who is expendable, who can be replaced, and who cannot, and you'd begin to wonder where you fall in that unspoken hierarchy, and that wondering would keep you awake at night, long after the sea has rocked everyone else to sleep, and you'd hear the ship creak and groan like something alive and dying at once, and the stars above would offer no comfort, only cold indifference. And you'd remember that pirates have no future, no retirement, no old age, only the hope of one more successful raid, one more narrow escape, one more day above the water. And you'd understand that every joke they tell is really a ward against despair, that every bout of laughter masks the knowledge that their lives are temporary, their graves likely unmarked at the bottom of the sea. And then there's the hunger not just for food, which is always short and rarely fresh, but the other kinds, the gnawing need for sensation, for escape, for anything to make the days feel less repetitive and the nights less haunted. And that's where the madness creeps in, not loudly, but in subtle ways, in superstitions that become law, in rituals before battles, in whispered warnings about cursed gold and mermaids who steal sanity. And at first you'd scoff, but after months without land and sleep and safety, you'd start to believe too, not because it makes sense, but because belief is better than emptiness. And so you'd tie charms to your belt, whisper apologies to the sea, knock 3 times on wood before stepping on deck, and you'd tell yourself it's harmless, but deep down you'd know that something has shifted in you. Something that once held firm now bends easily, and you'd see it in your reflection, in eyes that dart too quickly, a jaw clenched even at rest, and you'd try to remember how long it's been since you've truly exhaled, and you wouldn't be able to. And the worst part is the dreams, not of monsters or storms, but of normal things: a quiet street, the sound of children laughing, bread warm from an oven, and you'd wake with tears in your eyes, ashamed to feel so weak, and you'd rise and face the crew and pretend you slept like a stone, and no one would ask, because they dream the same dreams, and silence is the only mercy they can give. And sometimes you'd wonder what brought each of them here, What final straw snapped and sent them to sea? And you'd want to ask, but you'd never dare, because those stories are buried deep, and digging them up brings pain, and pirates avoid pain when they can, and when they can't, they inflict it on others, and you'd see that too, when tempers flare and arguments turn to knives, and punishment is swift and final, and you'd understand that mercy is a luxury they can't afford, because kindness breeds weakness, and weakness invites challenge. And on this ship, challenge means blood. So everyone smiles a little too wide, laughs a little too loudly, keeps their weapons close even during meals. And you'd learn that this isn't paranoia, it's protocol. And when you finally realize that you've adapted, that your hand moves to your dagger before your thoughts have caught up, that you watch your back even among allies, that you no longer flinch at screams, you'd feel a cold pride and a deep grief, because survival has changed you in ways you never wanted. And you'd wonder if you could ever go back, and worse, if you even want to. And that is why you wouldn't last with pirates, not because you'd die quickly, but because you might survive, and in doing so, become something you don't recognize. And some nights, when the ship is still and the moon is low, you'd feel the weight of your choices settle on your chest like a cannonball, and you'd lie awake, not afraid of dying, but afraid of forgetting who you were before the sea called your name. You wouldn't last a day with pirates, because the real hardship wasn't the cannon fire, or the sword fights, or the storms that turned the sea into a roiling madness. It was the monotony, the relentless grind of day after day aboard the same wooden coffin drifting across endless blue. And at first the horizon might feel like freedom, like possibility, but it wouldn't take long before it became a cage, too, stretching in every direction, mocking your need for destination. And you'd wake each morning not with purpose, but with duty, with the knowledge that the rigging must be checked, the sails mended, the deck scrubbed of the previous day's blood and bile and salt, and nothing would ever feel clean, no matter how hard you scraped, because the sea leaves a film on everything, a reminder that it owns you, body and soul, and in the silence between commands, you'd hear things you shouldn't, whispers in the timbers, the groan of the mast like a voice just out of reach, your own thoughts growing louder and less coherent, as the days stretched out like ghost limbs, and you'd come to dread the calm more than the storm, because at least storms gave you something to fight, but calm seas gave you yourself. And that was the most dangerous enemy of all, and you'd see it in the eyes of your crewmates, that slow unraveling, that glassy stare that hinted at worlds behind their gaze that no longer aligned with your own, and you'd try not to meet those eyes for too long, for fear of being pulled in. And so you'd focus on the work, on the knots and pulleys and barrels and maps, even though the maps led nowhere and the barrels always ran low, and food became a ritual of disappointment, hardtack riddled with weevils, salted meat you couldn't chew without bleeding, water that smelled of rot but was still precious, and the way men stared when rations were distributed would remind you of dogs, not companions. And in that hunger, something primal would awaken, and you'd feel it in yourself too, a tightening of the jaw, a sharpening of the senses, a readiness to do whatever was necessary to stay ahead, to stay alive. And then there were the punishments, always public, always brutal, because discipline on a pirate ship was maintained through fear, not order. And when someone stepped out of line, the whole crew gathered not just to witness, but to absorb the message, to internalize the cost of rebellion. And the lash wasn't just a tool of pain, it was a language, one that carved its meaning into the backs of those who dared to think themselves above the code, and you'd find yourself flinching less each time, until you didn't flinch at all, and that would scare you more than the violence ever did, because it meant you were adapting, you were becoming like them, or worse, like who you needed to be to remain among them. And the captain, he wouldn't be some storybook figure with a feathered hat and a twinkle in his eye. No, he'd be a man of few words and fewer emotions, a man who had seen too much and felt too little, whose presence alone could silence a crew of killers. And you'd respect him, even fear him, not because he was cruel, but because he understood the price of survival and paid it without complaint. And when he looked at you, you'd feel seen not as who you are, but as who you could become under the right pressure, and that knowledge would cling to you, sticky and unshakable. And every time you hoisted a sail or cleaned a blade or watched a ship grow on the horizon with the promise of violence and spoils, you'd wonder how much of yourself you were trading for another day of breathing. And then there were the nights, long and heavy, when the stars blinked like indifferent gods and the cold seeped through your bones no matter how many layers you wore, and you'd lie in your hammock, eyes open, listening to the sea slap against the hull, and the creak of rope would sound like someone hanging, and the snore of a crewmate would sound like a death rattle, and your mind would wander to things you hadn't thought about in years, a mother's lullaby, the smell of bread in the morning, the way your name sounded when spoken with love, and these memories would stab, not soothe, because they belonged to someone else now, someone who didn't exist in this world of rust and salt and blood. And you'd turn over and bury your face in your arm and try to sleep, but the dreams wouldn't come, or if they did, they'd be of drowning. And you'd wake gasping, gripping the edge of your hammock like it could save you. And you wouldn't tell anyone because dreams were weakness. And weakness invited attention, and attention was fatal. And so you'd put on your face, your pirate face, and join the crew in their games and fights and laughter that sounded like thunder but never reached the heart. And every day you'd chip away a little more at the person you used to be, until all that was left was someone who could survive this, and maybe even thrive. And that is why you wouldn't last a day with pirates, not because you'd be killed or thrown overboard, but because you'd last longer than you should, and in doing so, you'd lose the only thing that made you human. You wouldn't last a day with pirates, because what they endured wasn't merely the danger of cannonballs or the lash of ropes against their weathered skin. It was the erosion of meaning, the disintegration of time, the way each day at sea bled into the next, until even the sun seemed disoriented, rising not with promise but with accusation. And the moon, once a symbol of mystery, became just another eye watching men unravel, and it began slowly, like a song you've heard too many times. The rhythm of labor and silence and forced merriment, the endless rituals of survival masquerading as freedom, and at first you'd cling to tasks for grounding, believing that work kept the madness at bay, that if you focused on the sail or the rope or the chart, you wouldn't hear the whispers. But the sea is louder than silence, louder than memory, louder than grief, and you'd begin to feel its voice, not in your ears but in your bones, a resonance that shifted your sense of what was real, and you'd look around and realize that no one else questioned it anymore, that the others moved not with intention but with instinct. Like beasts in a cage, they've forgotten how to escape, and you'd envy their detachment even as it terrified you, because it meant they'd crossed a line you hadn't yet, a line where identity melts into necessity, where names and dreams are stripped away by wind and brine, and L that remains is function, and function has no room for softness. And that's when you begin to understand. The songs, the drunken chants, the old sailor rhymes, they weren't entertainment, they were spells. Chants to hold the self together, to remind each other they were still men, and not machines of muscle and rage. And even then, they didn't always work. Because madness aboard a pirate ship doesn't announce itself, it creeps in the gaps between laughter. It nests in idle hands. It grows in the eyes of men who no longer blink at horror. And you'd see it in the galley, in the man who stirs stew that tastes of nothing and smells worse, who hums a lullaby no one recognizes, and whose fingers tremble not from cold but from what he's remembering or trying to forget. And you'd see it in the man who talks to birds that aren't there, or the one who carves tiny coffins from driftwood and hides them in the bilge. And you'd tell yourself they're harmless, but late at night, when the creaking gets rhythmic and the waves whisper names, you'd wonder what they know that you don't. And your fear wouldn't be of dying, but of not knowing the moment you cross into that same fog. And it isn't just the mind that erodes, it's the body, too. Because pirates were not well-fed warriors in tales, but gaunt, bruised, brittle creatures with missing teeth and infected wounds. And no surgeon worth his salt ever chose piracy unless he was running from something, and the one you'd meet would smell of rum and clove, and his tools would be rusted, and his laugh would sound like a threat, and you'd pray never to need him, but you would eventually, because everyone bleeds, and when it happens, you'd lie on a table that once held fish guts, and you'd watch a man decide which part of you was still useful, and which could be cut away, and you'd bite down on leather and scream into a world that doesn't care, and when it's over, you'd drink until you forgot which limb used to be yours, and the others would slap your back and call you lucky, and you'd laugh. Because it's that or weep, and there's no space for weeping here, and there's no justice. Either only balance, only survival, and you'd learn that when a man takes too much, someone takes something from him. Not because it's fair, but because it keeps the peace. And peace on a pirate ship is like calm on the sea, deceptive, temporary, and dangerous if misunderstood, and you'd see how grudges fester in silence. How revenge is plotted not in rage, but in patience. And when it comes not with spectacle, but with subtlety, a cut line, a missing rung, a nudge during the next storm, and the crew would know, but say nothing. Because justice isn't a code, it's a consensus. And you'd begin to feel that weight too, the need to watch your words, your steps, your share, and you'd miss the safety of rules, even the unjust ones, because at least they were written, and here, everything is mutable. Everything depends on wind and mood and memory, and worst of all, you'd change too. You'd catch yourself laughing at cruelty, shrugging at loss, feeling nothing when a body hits the waves. And you'd wonder when it happened, the shift, the slow surrender, and you'd try to trace it back to the day you lied to save your skin, or the night you ignored a cry for help, or the moment you looked into another's eyes and saw your own fear mirrored there and you'd fail, because it doesn't happen in moments. It happens in erosion, like cliffs giving way to tide, bit by bit, and by the time you notice, it's already too late. And that is why you wouldn't last a day with pirates, not because you wouldn't survive, but because you would, and you'd pay for every breath with pieces of your soul. And one day, when the sea is still and your ship crests a wave like the last beat of a dying heart, you'd realize that nothing is waiting at the horizon. No treasure, no homecoming, no redemption, only more blue, more wind, more ghosts, and you'd keep sailing, because stopping means sinking, and sinking is the only escape that no pirate dares to speak aloud. You wouldn't last a day with pirates because the sea does not just steal, it replaces, and what it gives back is not always recognizable, not always human, and by the time you've memorized every creak of the hull and every shift in the wind, by the time your hands have grown calloused beyond sensation, and your skin has darkened into something the sun can no longer burn, you will have forgotten the sound of your own name spoken kindly, and the only voice that matters now is the one that bellows orders from the quarterdeck, or whispers secrets in the dark when no one else is listening. And you will have learned that pirates are not brothers, not truly, no matter how many times they swear it with rum-stained lips and bloodied palms pressed together over a stolen coin. They are competitors in a rigged game where the rules shift like tides and alliances are currency. And if you think yourself you will quickly discover that cleverness is a candle in a hurricane, flickering out just when you need it most, because survival isn't about cunning, it's about endurance, about knowing when to speak, and when to vanish, when to fight, and when to flee, and no one tells you when the test begins, because it never ends. And the faces around you become masks worn too long, the smiles too wide, the laughs too sharp, and behind them are histories too heavy to share, griefs too dangerous to admit. And so you trade silence for belonging, and in that silence, you lose the shape of who you were. And there are no mirrors on a pirate ship, because no one wants to look into their own eyes and see the things they've done reflected back at them. And if you find one some polished brass or a still pool of rainwater in a bucket, you'll catch a glimpse of someone you almost remember. And the sight will frighten you more than any blade, because you'll realize you've become someone who no longer fears death but fears recognition, fears being known, even by yourself. And on certain nights, when the sea calms and the stars arrange themselves in constellations you thought only poets cared about, you will feel the ache of what you left behind, and you'll lie awake and wonder if the price was worth it. If freedom paid in isolation and blood is truly freedom, and you'll think of land not as home but as myth, and you'll dream not of riches but of rest, of peace, of a place where no one watches you eat or sleep or breathe, where you are not a weapon or a liability or a tool, just a man again, and you'll wake to laughter too loud, too sharp. And you'll remember that dreams are treacherous. And so you will rise and move through your tasks with the quiet efficiency of someone who has surrendered to the rhythm of it all. And that rhythm is not life, it is survival, and it is the heartbeat of the ship. A heartbeat made of footsteps and rope and the ever-present groan of wood against water. And it never stops, not even when the ship is docked. Because the sea follows pirates, even onto land. It clings to them like salt on skin. And if you are ever allowed ashore, and that is a privilege, not a right, you will find the land tilts strangely beneath your feet, as if rejecting you, as if you no longer belong, and perhaps you don't. Because the land has rules, and walls and expectations, and pirates unlearn those things the moment they choose the sea. And if you speak too freely, if you laugh too loudly, or stare too long at someone's purse, you will draw attention, and attention leads to questions, and pirates do not like questions, and you will find yourself looking back toward the ship, not with dread, but with relief. Because it is familiar, it is cruel in ways you understand, and it demands less of you than the land ever did, and you will climb the gangplank with the resigned steps of a man returning not to prison, but to purpose. And the sails will snap and the ropes will groan, and you will slip back into your role as easily as a knife into its sheath, and no one will comment, because they too have done the same. And none of you speak of what the land shows you, because speaking of it gives it power, and power is dangerous. And that is why pirates drink and fight and sing and steal, not for pleasure but for distraction, because stillness is unbearable. And silence is a mirror none of you can afford to look into. And the only stories told are those that make others laugh, or shudder, or raise a cup. Never those that make them think, and especially never those that make them remember. And in this way, the ship becomes its own world, its own time, and you exist outside the calendar, outside the clock, suspended in a limbo where the only direction is forward, the only measure of success is continued breath, and the only legacy is the fear your name inspires in others. And even that is fleeting, because names fade, and ships sink, and the sea forgets, and the only ones who remember are the ghosts, and the ship has plenty of them, and you will learn to nod to the empty space beside you, to greet the shadow in your hammock, to pour a drop of rum into the waves for the men who didn't wake, and you will do it not because you believe, but because it feels right, and because no one survives the sea alone, and every pirate knows that the ones who walk beside you may not always be living, but they are always watching, and when your time comes, and it will, you will hope they greet you kindly, and that your sins are no worse than theirs, and that the sea takes you quickly, without pain, and maybe even with a little grace. Though pirates never speak that word aloud because grace is for saints, and no one here pretends to be one, and that is why you wouldn't last a day with pirates, not because the world would break you, but because it would shape you, mold you into something unrecognizable, and when the wind howls and the water rises, and your voice joins the chorus, oh, F the damned, you will wonder if this was your choice after all, or if the sea had chosen you long before you ever set foot on its deck. You wouldn't last a day with pirates, because what they endured wasn't just a matter of hardship or horror, it was the unraveling of meaning itself. The slow drowning of everything sacred beneath the rising tide of necessity. And by the time you stepped foot on a pirate ship, you'd already have given up something essential just to be there, because no one chose that life for the adventure, not truly, not once they understood what it meant. And the ones who said they did were either liars or mad, and sometimes both. And when you first boarded the ship, everything would smell wrong, the mixture of sweat and damp wood, of old blood not quite scrubbed from the planks, of spoiled food lingering in the seams of barrels, and worse than the stench would be the silence between the noise. The way laughter died too quickly and footsteps paused too long, and you'd feel watched, not by one person, but by the very structure around you, as if the ship itself held memories and moods, as if the boards creaked not from motion but from grief, and you'd be told where to sleep and what to do, and the men who gave you orders wouldn't raise their voices because they wouldn't need to, and when someone died, which they often did, you'd be expected to carry on, to pick up their task, to move their hammock aside like it had never existed, and no one would say their name again, not because of disrespect, but because names made things real, and pirates lived best in denial, and as days blurred into each other, you'd feel your old life flake away like sunburned skin, and memories would become treacherous. They'd arrive at inopportune times, uninvited, overwhelming, and always cruel, because you'd recall the warmth of a hearth or the scent of bread, only to find yourself eating cold porridge from a wooden bowl with weevils crawling on the rim. And no one would complain because complaints were dangerous. Complaints invited scrutiny, and scrutiny led to suspicion. And suspicion was a seed that grew quickly in the cracked soil of paranoia, and you'd watch it spread among the crew like rot, infecting every glance, every joke, every silence, until someone snapped. And when that happened, you'd be forced to choose a side without knowing what the conflict was about, and you'd pray your choice was the right one, not because you believed in justice, but because you valued your throat remaining uncut in the middle of the night, and you'd sleep with a knife under your blanket, or not at all, and when you did sleep, your dreams would turn strange, full of teeth and wind and water that spoke in voices too familiar, and you'd wake with a start, only to find that the nightmare hadn't ended, it had just changed angles. And the faces around you wouldn't be cruel at first, but distant, detached, like they'd forgotten how to care or couldn't afford to. And eventually, you'd learn to mimic that gaze, that half-lidded stare of those who have seen too much and decided to stop acknowledging it. And the games they played would make you uneasy, the dice carved from knuckle bones, the stories that began as jokes but ended in screams, the superstitions so deeply believed they were followed even over reason, like never whistling on deck lest you summon a storm, or always leaving the first spoonful of stew untouched for the dead. And you'd follow them too, not because you believed, but because belief had become irrelevant, because doubt was more dangerous than faith in that world, and your hands would bleed from rope and salt and splinters, and your back would ache from the constant stoop of sail work, and your eyes would burn from staring into too much sun, and you'd begin to confuse hunger with boredom, thirst with grief, rage with fear, and you'd realize how thin the layers of your civility had been, how easily they peeled away to reveal something feral, something ancient. And no matter how much you told yourself you were different, you weren't. Not anymore. And when the opportunity came to do something terrible in exchange for mercy or gold, or simply a moment of safety, you'd hesitate just long enough to feel shame, but not long enough to stop yourself, and afterward, you'd drink to forget, and when that didn't work, you'd blame the rum, and when that didn't work, you'd blame the sea, 'cause blaming yourself would mean accepting that you had changed. And the truth is, you'd already done that when you stepped aboard, and you'd learn the stories were all lies, or at least distorted. There were no treasure chests buried on islands, no damsels rescued from cruel fate, no noble rebels fighting against tyranny, only men who'd run out of options, who traded one form of oppression for another dressed in different colors. And the gold they sought wasn't for freedom, it was for forgetting, for drowning the memories of what they'd lost and what they'd become. And they spent it as quickly as they stole it, because permanence was terrifying, and you'd see how some of them aged before your eyes, not in years, but in resignation, in the way their shoulders slumped and their voices faded. And you'd realize that death wasn't feared on a pirate ship, it was expected, like a guest running late. And when it came, it was greeted not with screams, but with quiet acknowledgement, like a debt being paid, And if you happen to live long enough to remember who you once were, you'd wonder if that person would recognize you now. And if they did, whether they'd be proud or horrified. And the answer wouldn't matter, because there'd be no one left to ask. And that is why you wouldn't last a day with pirates, not because you couldn't handle the pain or the filth or the violence, but because you could. And in doing so, you'd discover parts of yourself you were never meant to meet. And you'd never be able to put them back in the dark where they belong. You wouldn't last a day with pirates, because the truth of that life was not the fire of rebellion, but the slow burn of resignation, not the roar of cannon fire, but the silence after a scream, and not the glitter of gold, but the stain it left behind. And by the time you realized what the sea demanded, you'd already be too far from shore to turn back, because no one truly warned you, not about the rituals that replaced religion, not about the makeshift totems tied to masts, or the bone fragments tucked into pockets as charms against drowning, not about the songs that were never finished, because finishing was bad luck, and not about the men who whispered to the waves like they expected answers. And when you asked why they did it, they wouldn't look at you, because admitting the sea speaks is one thing, but admitting it listens is another entirely. And in time, you'd do it too. You'd begin to treat the ocean like a thing alive, a creature with moods and memory and motive. Because how else do you explain the storms that come only after laughter, or the calm that follows betrayal, or the way the air stills when someone lies, and you'd find yourself knocking twice on wood before stepping onto deck, or flipping a coin before each meal. And not because you believed it mattered, but because you couldn't afford to be the one who didn't. And you'd start seeing patterns where there were none, omens in the flight of birds, signs in the ripple of water. And you wouldn't talk about it because no one did, not openly, but the belief ran deeper than faith, and deeper than fear, and no one challenged it because pirates understood that the moment you stop honoring the madness, it claims you, and the worst fate wasn't death. It was irrelevance, fading from the story entirely. And so you'd carve your name into something, anything, hoping it might outlive you, a plank, a beam, a blade, but even that wasn't safe, because names are dangerous aboard a ship. They carry weight, they summon attention, and too much attention meant envy, and envy meant danger, and that's when you'd understand the most horrifying truth of all, that you could do everything right, work the sails, haul the ropes, keep your head down and your blade sharp, and still die for nothing, for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or for reminding someone of someone they'd rather forget, and there'd be no justice, no trial, no last words, just a shove, a splash, and a void where you once were. And even if someone remembered you, it wouldn't be your story they told. It would be theirs, and you'd become a footnote in someone else's legend, and that's all any pirate ever was. And once you saw it, once you understood how thin the line was between myth and meat, you'd either break or become something else entirely. Something hollowed out and reshaped by salt and time and silence. And the worst part is, you wouldn't notice the change until you heard yourself laughing at something that should have made you sick. Or until you looked at someone drowning and felt nothing. Not pity, not fear, not even relief. Just the same cold acknowledgement you'd seen in the eyes of others. And that's when you'd know the sea had won. And that it never takes all at once. It takes in layers, in slivers, in breaths. And if you ask the oldest man on board how he'd survived, he wouldn't speak. He'd just look at you with eyes that had forgotten call, and you'd realize he didn't survive, he endured. And enduring isn't the same as living. And every day you endured, you'd lose something else. A memory, a habit, a kindness, and you'd stop counting the losses because it hurt too much. And the only numbers that mattered now were shares and kills and rations. And time itself would warp, because days at sea aren't measured in hours. They're measured in storms and land sightings and deaths. And every sunrise felt more like a dare than a promise. And you'd forget how old you were, not because you aged faster, but because you stopped caring. And the only birthday celebrated was the day someone joined the crew. And even then, It wasn't celebration, it was warning. A reminder that this was the beginning of forgetting. And you'd drink not to numb the pain, but to remember what pleasure felt like. Even if it was just the memory of it, and sometimes the rum would make you brave enough to speak of land, of home, of things you missed, and everyone would go quiet. Not out of respect, but because longing was contagious and deadly, and to want something you couldn't reach was a weakness. And pirates respected strength, even if it was fake, especially if it was fake, and the masks you wore to survive would become your skin, and you wouldn't recognize your own face if you saw it, which you wouldn't, because mirrors were cursed, and even still water was suspect, and the idea of seeing your own eyes was too intimate, too revealing, and you'd stop asking questions, not because you had answers, but because questions invited change, and change was dangerous, and all that mattered now was the next port, the next raid, the next storm, and you'd cling to routine like a lifeline and hate anyone who broke it, because without it, there was nothing. Just chaos and sea and the screaming wind, and in the rare moments when you saw land and were allowed to touch it, it wouldn't feel like home, it would feel foreign and small and too quiet. And you'd long for the creak of wood and the slap of sails and the groan of rope under tension, because the sea had become your cage and your cradle, and you wouldn't know how to live without it. And that is why you wouldn't last a day with pirates, not because the life would kill you, but because it would claim you, piece by piece, until you forgot there was ever anything else. You wouldn't last a day with pirates because the end never comes as thunder. It comes as a whisper, a slow erosion of what made you human. And by the time you realize it, there is nothing left to save, and no one to save it. Because on a pirate ship, mercy is a myth, redemption a story for children, and change is not a choice. It is inevitability wrapped in tar and tide. And the further you sail from shore, the more the land becomes legend. A half-remembered warmth that doesn't fit the cold edge of your blade, and even if you were the kindest soul on earth, the kind of person who paused to help wounded birds and wept at poetry, the sea would laugh in your face and carve those parts of you out with its salt-wet hands, and you wouldn't even bleed. You'd just grow quieter, harder, your hands steady where they shouldn't be, your breath calm where panic used to live. And one day, without knowing when it began, you'd stop blinking at cruelty, and that's when you'd know the transformation was complete. Because pirates don't celebrate birthdays or holidays, they celebrate survival. And even that isn't joy, it's relief, temporary, brittle. And you learn quickly not to trust laughter, not when it's too loud, not when it comes after silence, not when it hides the tension that coils beneath every jest. And if you think you can bring reason or order or fairness, the ship will teach you otherwise. Because fairness requires balance, and nothing about pirate life is balanced. It's blood and coin, betrayal and impulse. A hierarchy built not on virtue or skill, but on fear and familiarity. And you can rise only by stepping over the broken backs of men you once called brothers. And if that sickens you, good, it means you haven't yet become like them, but you will. And the first time you slit a throat in the dark, not for gold or vengeance, but for convenience, you'll understand how far you've fallen, and no amount of prayer will lift you back up, because there are no saints at sea. And even the gods stop listening past a certain longitude, and you'll start to believe in older things, things with no names and no altars, things that live in the depths and whisper in storms, and you won't speak of them, not even to yourself. But you'll begin to carry a charm, a bone, a shell, a tooth, and you'll never admit why. But if you lose it, you'll wake in a sweat, convinced something is watching, and maybe it is. Because the sea remembers, and the sea takes what it's owed, and if it spares you once, it never forgets, and your debt will find you, whether in the jaws of another crew, or in the cracked wood beneath you, our feet, or in the fever dreams that come when the food spoils and the water runs low, and you'll beg the sky for mercy. But all it will give you is more sky, and the men around you won't offer comfort, Because comfort is weakness, and weakness spreads like rot. And they've seen too many kind hearts dragged overboard by kindness, and so they will sneer or ignore or joke. And you'll laugh too, not because it's funny, but because laughter is armor, and silence is an invitation. And if you speak of what haunts you, you become it. And if you pretend it's not real, sometimes it goes away, and other times it doesn't. And that's the game. The sea never tells you the rules, it just watches how you play. And if you slip, if you falter, if your grip loosens for a moment, it takes you not with a scream, but with a sigh, like a lover bored of waiting. And the only thing left behind is your hammock, rolled tight, your cup empty, and your name already fading from the lips of those who shared your breath. Because pirates don't mourn, they adapt. And the only legacy that matters is the one carved in scars, in stories half true and twice told, in the warnings passed to green boys who think piracy is glory. And no one corrects them, because hope is useful until it isn't, and then it's dangerous. And you will learn to be suspicious of joy, to view kindness as a trap, and generosity as manipulation. And you'll stop trusting your own instincts, because they were shaped on land. And the sea is another animal entirely, one that devours the familiar and spits out something feral, and the lines between right and wrong, good and evil, they blur until all that matters is survival. And even that becomes suspect, because what is survival if you've lost the parts of yourself worth saving? And one day, you'll wake and realize you don't remember your mother's face, or the sound of a child's laugh, or the taste of fruit that wasn't half rotten, and it will hit you not like a wave, but like absence, like the cold space beside you where no one ever lay, and you'll laugh, or cry, or just stare, and none of it will help, because there's nothing to reach for anymore. And the stars you navigate by will feel like strangers, and the wind will no longer soothe, and the ship, once your whole world, will feel like a coffin, and you'll keep moving anyway. Because what else is there? And that is why you wouldn't last a day with pirates, not because you're too soft or too weak or too noble, but because you still remember what it means to care. And in a world where everything is transaction, care is the first thing you lose and the last thing you miss. And when it's gone, you won't even know it until someone screams and you don't flinch, or dies and you don't pause, and you'll realize you've become exactly what you feared, and it won't matter, because there's no one left to notice but the sea, and the sea does not weep, it only swallows. You wouldn't last a day with pirates, because there comes a moment, not marked by cannon fire or mutiny or some cinematic betrayal, but by a pause, a space between commands, between swells, between breaths, when you realize that everything you were has been scraped away by salt and time and necessity, and standing in its place is something else, something shaped by hunger and fear and endless noise, and it doesn't wear your name, not really, not anymore. And the worst part isn't that you've changed, it's that you don't mind, and you start to look at others not as people, but as roles, as threats or tools or meat. And it doesn't shock you when someone dies, not even a friend, not even someone you joked with at dusk the night before. Because death isn't an event aboard a pirate ship, it's a condition, a weather, a tax that everyone pays. And you pay it by pretending it doesn't matter, by stepping over bodies, by taking the coat from a corpse because it's warmer than yours. And no one blames you, because they do the same. And there's no room for guilt when your only luxury is survival, and even that comes with conditions. And if you think leadership will shield you, it won't. Because a captain is only a captain until he isn't. And the moment he falters, the moment he hesitates or forgives or remembers, he's human. Someone sharper, colder, and more willing takes his place. And the sea doesn't care. It never did. And the crew doesn't mourn. They adjust. And the blood is washed away before it dries. And the maps are passed to the next hand. And the story continues without you, as if you never existed. And the same will happen to you. Whether it's a knife in the dark, a shot in the back, or simply a rope that snaps when no one double-checked the knot. And it won't be personal. Not really, it never is. Because on a pirate ship, personal is dangerous. And every bond is temporary. Every friendship a risk. Every shared moment one more crack in the armor you need to wear just to wake up in the morning. And you learn to smile without me. Ning it. To laugh without joy. To cry only when no one sees. Because even tears can be ammunition in the wrong hands. And secrets are worth their weight in rum and silver. And the ones who last aren't the strongest or the smartest, they're the quiet ones. The watchers. The ones who keep their backs to the wall and their thoughts to themselves. And if you're loud, if you're proud, if you think your wit will save you, it won't. Because cleverness is only valued until it becomes a threat. And no one wants to share a deck with someone who makes them feel small. And you will be tested again and again, not by storms or sea beasts, but by silence, by stares, by the simple, unbearable weight of being unwanted. And if you falter, if you beg or lash out or try to explain yourself, they'll smile, nod, and push you further out until you're on the edge of every circle. The last to eat, the first to clean, and no one will call it punishment. Because it isn't. It's adjustment, and you either learn to fold yourself into the shape they need or you get cut away. And even if you manage that, even if you become invisible and useful and agreeable, you're still only safe for as long as you're necessary. And the moment the ship changes course, the moment your skill is no longer needed, the moment you remind someone of something they'd rather forget, you're gone. And it won't be a scene, it won't be a trial, it'll be quiet, efficient, and final. And the sea will take you without a ripple, and the ship will sail on, because it always does, and your name will vanish. Not just from memory, but from the very grain of the wood. And the place where you slept will be filled by another, and if they ask who you were, the answer will be a shrug, because there are no legacies on a pirate ship, only intervals, and the moment you start to think otherwise, you've already made the mistake that will end you. And even if you manage to survive, to climb, to claim your piece of the command, it's not victory, it's another kind of sentence. Because now every eye is watching, every whisper might be your undoing, and you sleep even less. And you eat even colder food, and you trust even less than you did before, and you stop dreaming, because dreams are dangerous when you have power. And if you slip, even once, they'll come for you, and they'll do it with a smile, with a joke, with a toast, and you'll be gone before the glass hits the floor, and they'll sing over your body like they did for the last one. And no one will notice your absence except the rats who miss your crumbs, and this endless cycle of fear and noise and silence and salt. This is why you wouldn't last a day with pirates. Because it's not the sea or the storms or the cutlasses that break you. It's the waiting, the watching, the knowing that no matter how fast you run, no matter how sharp you get, no matter how much of yourself you cut away to fit the mold, the sea always wants more. And one day, when you have nothing left, it'll still reach for you. And you'll give it what little remains, because anything is better than the waiting. You wouldn't last a day with pirates, because even if you somehow endured the hunger, the salt, the betrayals, and the silence, what would finally unravel you wouldn't be a blade or a storm, it would be the unbearable repetition of it all, the endless sameness of horizon and deck and duty, the rituals you cling to, not out of belief but desperation, the way your fingers learn to tie knots before your thoughts do. The way you start to speak in short, clipped phrases, not because of efficiency, but because full sentences feel like a luxury you no longer deserve, and the music that once lifted your heart now grates, because it reminds you of the version of yourself that used to sing. And he's gone, drowned in days indistinguishable from each other. And the others won't notice you're unraveling, because they're unraveling too, just slower or quieter or more skillfully, and some of them have been undone for years and simply wear their emptiness like armor. And when you try to find someone who still remembers why they came to sea in the first place, no one answers. Not because they're hiding something, but because they truly don't remember. Because memory is fragile when surrounded by nothing but water and want, and over time, even the sky seems to mock you. The stars familiar and yet alien, The moon your only constant companion, and even she turns her face from you half the time, and you begin to crave not treasure or land but novelty, a voice you haven't heard, a smell that isn't rot or salt, a story that doesn't end in death or gold. And when a bird lands on the mast, you stare at it like a miracle, like a ghost, because it reminds you there is still a world beyond this, a world that doesn't creak or bleed or rot, and the bird flies away, and you feel abandoned all over again. And the jokes stop being funny because you've heard them 1,000 times, and the songs rot in your throat because even melody begins to taste like salt, and no one tells new stories because no one dares invent something that might not be true. Because on a pirate ship, lies are dangerous. They give hope, and hope leads to dreams, and dreams lead to longing, and longing leads to mistakes, and mistakes lead to the ocean. And so you laugh at the same tales, and nod at the same boasts, and pretend that it's enough. But inside, something sours, something sharpens. And one night you'll find yourself whispering to the sea, not out of madness, but out of habit. And the sea will not answer, but you'll feel watched, and it will comfort you. Because being seen, even by something vast and merciless, is better than being forgotten. And you'll keep speaking, long after the others have fallen asleep, spinning thoughts into the dark like thread, and you won't remember when you started doing it, but one night someone will hear you and ask who you're talking to, and you'll lie, say it was nothing, say it was a dream, and they'll nod too quickly and walk away and never sit near you again, because they know what it means to talk to the water, and they fear the moment it talks back. And if you think you're immune, if you think you can cling to yourself in the face of all this, think again, because even the captains lose pieces of themselves, and the ones who don't become worse become monsters wearing men's skin, keeping order not with leadership but with fear, their eyes hollow, their hearts locked in chests long sunk, and when they sleep, and some never do, they do so with blades in hand and one eye open, and the crew respects them, not out of love, but because fear is reliable. And if you want to survive, truly survive, you'll become like them. You'll trade kindness for calculation, memory for reflex, warmth for numbness, and no one will stop you, because no one wants a man who feels they want a man who obeys, who endures, who becomes predictable in his coldness, because predictability is the only currency safer than gold, and so you'll learn your lines. You'll hide your pain, you'll eat your silence, and you'll begin to hate the land, not because you love the sea, but because land represents everything you can't have anymore. Stillness, softness, forgiveness. And the cruel truth is that even if you made it back to land, even if you walked barefoot on grass and slept under a roof and ate fruit from a tree, you wouldn't belong anymore. You'd look at people and see tools, threats, competition. You'd flinch at laughter. You'd sleep with a blade. You'd mistrust peace. And worst of all, you'd miss the sea, not the beauty of it, not the freedom they always sing about, but the control, the clarity, the absence of choice. Because when everything is stripped away, you don't have to wonder who you are. And the sea gives you that, even as it takes everything else. And you wouldn't last a day with pirates, because no one truly does. Not even the ones who survive. Because surviving isn't living, and when you finally understand that, when you see your reflection in a puddle and don't recognize the man staring back, it will be too late to turn around, too late to remember who you were, and the sea will open its arms again, patient, waiting, knowing it never needed to kill you, only to wait for you to give up the rest. You wouldn't last a day with pirates, because the final erosion is not loud. It's a gentle, silent smoothing over of the edges you once thought defined you, and it happens so slowly, so insidiously, that you wake one morning not knowing how many days have passed since you laughed sincerely, or dreamed of anything other than silence, or remembered a time when you weren't always scanning the deck for signs of tension, betrayal, hunger, or storm. Because when you live among pirates, you live among men and women who wear masks not for deception, but for survival. And behind each mask is a story too dangerous to tell, and when the time comes for punishment or mercy, they don't choose, they watch, and let the sea decide. And that decision is often made not in storms or mutinies, but in something smaller. A splinter left to fester, a drop knife, a look held a second too long. Because nothing is forgotten. Not really, not here, not by the sea. And if you believe in justice, you will be broken by its absence. And if you don't, you'll be broken by its return. Because even in the rare moments when something good happens, when a ship is taken with no blood, when treasure is found with no curse, when laughter echoes without mockery, you'll feel a chill, a sense that balance must be restored, and it always is. And often it's your blood that pays the price, or your friends, or the only person left who remembered your name before you shortened it, before you hardened it, before you wore it like a shell. And if you ever try to leave, to walk away from this life, to step back onto land and forget the creak of rope and the taste of rain, you'll find you can't. Not because you're hunted, but because you've become foreign to peace, allergic to comfort, a stranger to yourself, and every soft thing will feel false, and every kindness will feel suspicious. And when you try to speak of what you saw, of what you did, no one will believe you, or worse, they'll pity you. And that pity will rot you faster than any storm, and you'll crave the clarity of danger again. The purpose that came from needing to stay alive just one more day. And this is what makes pirate life so cruel, not that it kills you, but that it ruins you for everything else. And the ones who manage to leave often return, not for gold, not for glory, but because the silence of land is too loud, the softness of beds too suffocating, and the sea, as merciless as it is at least honest. And in that honesty, you feel known, even loved, in a way that no man should crave, but every pirate eventually does. And the worst part is that once you've reached this point, you no longer care whether you last or not, because lasting becomes meaningless, and all that remains is momentum. A series of tasks, gestures, routines that keep the body moving even as the soul dims. And if anyone were to ask you what you want, what you hope for, you wouldn't know how to answer, because pirates don't dream, not anymore. And they don't hope, they calculate. And they don't live, they persist. And in that persistence is a kind of madness that doesn't shout, it whispers, and it finds its way into your hands, into your gait, into the way your eyes move when someone calls your name, and by the time you notice it, you're already too far gone. And no amount of gold, no amount of forgiveness, no amount of land beneath your feet will bring you back, because you've learned to walk like the sea, endless, unsympathetic, unbound, and people will feel that in you, and they'll step back, and you'll wonder if it was worth it, and the answer will never come. Because that's the final truth. Pirates don't get answers, only echoes. You wouldn't last a day with pirates, because even if you've survived the betrayals, the storms, the starvation, the filth, the endless routine, the aching suspicion, and the dull, pounding paranoia of a life lived on the edge of the knife, there comes a final evolution. One last transformation more devastating than any wound or war, and it's not something you feel happen in a single moment. No crack or snap or sharp realization, but a slow, creeping shift like a tide that rises not to drown you but to cradle you in indifference, and you look around at the faces on the deck, leathery and blank and barely human, and you realize you've become one of them, that the salt has carved away not just your skin but your empathy, that the stories you use to tell yourself of a future, of redemption, of a final haul, and a quiet cottage inland, are now just background noise, irrelevant songs hummed by a version of yourself you no longer remember. And if someone were to ask you now what your name was before all this, you'd pause, not out of dramatic effect, but because you genuinely need to recall it. And even when it returns, it feels strange in your mouth, like a borrowed word, and you think back to the first time you stepped on board and how the wind smelled like something infinite, and now it just smells like decay. And the only infinity you know is the repetition of the days, the empty sky and the unchanging stars, and the same calloused hands tying the same knots, swabbing the same planks, lowering the same boats. And you wouldn't last a day with pirates, not because of the violence, but because of the emptiness, the vast and bottomless quiet that comes after all the screams and blood and desperation are spent. And now you sit on a barrel, staring at nothing, waiting not for land or treasure, but for the next thing to do. And if it doesn't come, you'll sit there until someone yells, or something breaks, or the sky shifts. Because motion is the only compass now, and even sleep is just a pause between movement, and dreams are no longer personal. They're shared hallucinations of the damned floating between hammocks and sails, stitched together by fear and guilt and longing. And when you speak in your sleep, you say things you don't understand, names you forgot, places you never visited, and in the morning, no one mentions it, because everyone does it. And the unspoken rule is that what's said in sleep belongs to the sea, not to the living. And if someone breaks that rule, asks you what you meant or what you dreamed, you know they're either new or slipping, and either way, they won't be here long, and maybe that's mercy. Because staying means becoming this hollow, this ritual, this collection of movements mistaken for a man. And it's not that you forget how to care, it's that you stop seeing the point, because caring gets people killed, and you've run out of space for more dead names. And even the ledger you used to keep in your mind of who owes what, who did what, who you trust is gone, overwritten by instinct, because reason is a liability, and the only logic left is survival. And it doesn't matter how you do it, only that you do. And if that means smiling at someone you hate or helping someone you know will betray you, so be it. Because the game isn't about loyalty, it's about duration, and the longer you last, the more invisible you become. And invisibility is safety, but it's also erasure. And one day you'll look in a broken piece of mirror and see nothing of what you once were. And you'll shrug and walk away, because there's no room for mourning here, no space for grief, only the next task, the next tide, the next port, and the promise of coin that never feels like enough. Not because it isn't, but because you've forgotten what enough ever looked like. And even when you dock and walk among landfolk, you can't unlearn the tension in your shoulders or the way you size up every doorway, every alley, every man's hands. And they look at you and sense something is wrong but can't place it. And they step aside without knowing why, and you pass through towns like a ghost, like something whispered about in fearful tones. And even when you try to smile, it doesn't reach your eyes, because you've forgotten how to let it. And this is why you wouldn't last a day with pirates. Not because you'd die, but because you'd live. And in doing so, lose everything that once made life worth living. You wouldn't last a day with pirates because by the time you've truly earned their silence, their nods, their space beside the barrel fire at night, it means you've already given up the most sacred parts of yourself. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in a million quiet trades, unnoticed and uncelebrated, like a coin dropped into the sea without a splash. And if you think that finally being accepted, finally being seen as one of them, means safety or family or belonging, then you're already lost. Because what you're being welcomed into isn't a brotherhood, it's a shared hallucination. It's a fever dream agreement to look the other way when reality scrapes too close to the surface. And the rites of passage aren't trials of courage or skill, they're tests of erosion. How much you're willing to unfeel, how convincingly you can laugh when something inhuman happens, how well you mimic the rhythms of men who have long forgotten how to be human. And it starts so simply: your first kill, your first theft, your first order barked without hesitation, and each time, someone claps you on the back or nods in approval. And something in you opens for that, craves it, because in a world of rot and noise and fear, recognition is a balm, and before you realize it, you chase that nod more than gold, and every action becomes a performance, a dance choreographed by ghosts. And no one tells you when the dance ends, because it doesn't. It only slows, becomes heavier, more ritual than reaction. and you find yourself saying things you don't mean, laughing at things you find horrible, defending men you wouldn't trust with your life, and then, eventually, giving them your life anyway. Because the bond between pirates isn't forged by love, it's soldered with shared guilt, mutual dirt, the knowledge that you all carry the same secrets, the same sins, and that if anyone ever truly talked, if anyone ever truly remembered the before, the whole thing would collapse, not in mutiny, but in shame. And shame is something none of you can afford, because once it starts, it spreads like rot, and the ship cannot sail if everyone sees the mold beneath the planks, so you pretend, day after day, drink after drink, raid after raid, and in that pretending, you begin to lose your sense of fiction, and if someone were to pull you aside and ask, "Who are you?" your mind would blank, not out of panic, but because the question has become irrelevant, like asking a wave what it was before it hit the shore. And you'll shrug, not sadly, but because there's nothing left to mourn, and in this numbness, you function better. You're faster, with a blade, calmer in storms, harder to manipulate, and the others respect you for it, never realizing you've stopped feeling entirely. And one night, when the moon is high and the sea is flat and the silence feels thicker than usual, someone will tell you a story, an old one, about a man who used to sing lullabies to himself before sleep, and they'll laugh at the absurdity, and you'll laugh too, not because it's funny, but because it hurts to remember that you once did the same, and you don't want anyone to know. And in that moment, you'll hate that version of yourself, call him weak, call him naive, because hating him is easier than grieving him. And pirates don't grieve not out loud, not in ways that show, and if they do it in sabotage, in cruelty, in withdrawal, and the ship will feel that tilt under it but keep moving anyway because motion is all it knows. And the next time you dock and walk among the townsfolk, you'll find you can't look them in the eye for too long, not because of guilt, but because of difference. You're not one of them anymore, and you never will be again. And even if you tried to speak of what you've seen, what you've become, the words wouldn't come, or they'd come out twisted, filtered through the dialect of the ship, the slang of brutality, and no one would understand. And so you stay silent, and silence becomes your language, and that too is accepted by the crew, because none of you speak unless necessary, and when you do, it's in code, in gesture, in glance. And you realize language was never for truth, it was for softness. And softness is a luxury long since tossed overboard. And this is what it means to belong to pirates, to live in a space where no one asks and no one answers, where the past is dead and the future doesn't matter, where each day is survived rather than lived, and where the only constant is the sea, endless and uncaring. And if you think you can dip a toe in this world and remain unchanged, you're mistaken. Because even a day with pirates is enough to infect your soul with their rhythm, their hunger, their resignation, and once that rhythm finds your pulse, it never leaves, it just waits, beneath every quiet moment, ready to rise again. You wouldn't last a day with pirates, because even if you survived the violence, even if your hands got steady and your mind grew sharp and your gut hardened into something mean and quiet, the final stretch, the part no one writes about, the part no ballad sings, is the aftermath. The years after the gold is spent and the rum is gone and the sea forgets your name, and you come ashore with nothing but a limp and a story, and you try to find land beneath your feet again, but everything feels soft and artificial and wrong, because there are no tides in the soil, no creaking wood to sing you to sleep, no smell of pitch and sweat and gunpowder, just stillness. And in that stillness, the ghosts come crawling, not the ones of the men you killed, but of the person you once were, the voices of every version of yourself you had to kill to survive among the pirates, and they are louder than the cannons ever were, because they speak in questions, not orders, and you have no answers. And when you walk through town now, no one knows you were once feared, once respected, once someone whose word could start or stop a mutiny. They just see a man with eyes like dead coins. and they step aside, not out of deference but discomfort, and you feel it, like a draft, and it eats at you. Because pirates do not age gracefully, they decay in public, becoming parables or warnings or jokes, and the only thing worse than dying at sea is not dying at all. And you try to tell your stories at taverns, but no one listens, or worse, they romanticize it. Turn your years of horror and compromise into entertainment, and you nod along because it's easier than explaining the truth. And the truth is that being a pirate was never about freedom or rebellion. It was about desperation, about the way the world crushes men, and how some choose to become monsters rather than be crushed. And now that you're no longer needed as a monster, you don't know what shape to take, so you float, untethered, looking for the edge of something, anything that feels real. And sometimes you return to the shore and look out at the sea and wonder if she remembers you, if she calls to you not with words but with silence, the kind that used to comfort you. And you think about going back, finding a ship, any ship, even if it's just a ghost of what once was, because at least there you knew your place. And on land, all the lines are blurry, all the faces are soft, and kindness feels like pity, and pity feels like poison. And maybe the worst thing about surviving pirates is that you realize too late that it was never just about the sea or the gold, it was about who you became when nothing was left to protect. And now that you're safe, you're no one, and you miss the fear because it reminded you you were alive, and you miss the danger because it meant summit.